Let me tell you a story of my very good friend. Let me tell you about Harold Mitchell. Call him Hal. Hal lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood in Tacoma, Washington, a city that sits on the shores of Puget Sound. His home was a small, but well-kept house in a neighborhood that had seen better days. A man who thought he'd built something solid, something lasting, only to watch it crumble like sand between his fingers. 67 years old, and what did he have to show for it? A cardboard box filled with desk trinkets, a company-branded coffee mug he'd drunk from for 32 years, and a severance package that felt more like a slap in the face than compensation. 32 years of loyalty, of showing up early and staying late, of missing his kids' baseball games and school plays, because the work needed doing, because providing for your family meant sacrifice, because that's what men of his generation were taught to believe. And how did they repay him? With a 20-minute meeting in a sterile conference room, some fresh-faced HR kid who couldn't have been older than 30 reading from a script about restructuring and new directions, and we appreciate your years of service, but what? But you're too old? But we want someone younger, someone cheaper, someone who doesn't remind us that loyalty used to mean something? They didn't say it outright. They never do they? But I heard it in every carefully chosen word, saw it in every averted glance. Age discrimination wrapped up in corporate doublespeak, tied with bow of false sympathy. The anger consumed him at first. Hot, burning rage that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, replaying every conversation, every performance review that had praised his work, every time they told him he was invaluable. Invaluable. What a joke. What a cruel, bitter joke. Because when it came down to it, when they needed to cut costs, he was the first to go, the old guy, the relic, the reminder that time moves forward whether we're ready or not. And then the fear set in, the cold, creeping terror that comes when you check your bank account and do the math, when you apply for job after job and hear nothing back, when you realize that the world has decided you're past your expiration date. His savings, what little he'd managed to put away after a divorce that had gutted him financially 20 years ago, evaporated faster than morning dew. Rent, utilities, food, insurance. The numbers didn't lie, and they didn't care about his pride or his panic. 6 months. That's how long it took for Harold Mitchell to go from a respected professional to a man with nowhere to go. 6 months of watching his life compress into smaller and smaller spaces, until finally, he had to make the call he'd sworn he'd never make. Andrew? It's Dad. I need to ask you something. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out like razor wire. When Andrew finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. What is it, Dad? I'm having some trouble with... Look, I lost my job a while back, and things are tight. I was wondering if maybe, temporarily, I could... You want to move in with me? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Just until I get back on my feet. A few months, maybe. I'm still looking for work, and... Fine. But I'm busy, Dad. Don't expect me to babysit you. Click. That conversation played on repeat in Hal's mind as he packed his life into boxes, as he hired a cheap moving company, as he drove across town to his son's house, a nice place in the suburbs, the kind of house I'd always dreamed of buying but never could afford. Andrew had done well for himself. Software something or other. Hal had never fully understood what his son did for a living, and that gap in understanding felt like just one more failure to add to the pile. When Hal arrived, Andrew was at work. There was a key under the mat and a text message. Guest room upstairs. Second door on the left. No welcome home. No let me help you unload. Just cold, clinical instructions, like he was checking into a motel. Hal stood in that guest room, surrounded by boxes, and felt the weight of his new reality settle over him like a shroud. This was supposed to be temporary. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his relationship with his son, to heal the wounds that had festered between them for years. But as he looked around the impersonal space, beige walls, generic furniture, not a single personal touch, he felt like an intruder, a burden, an unwelcome guest in his own son's life. The first few days were awkward but tolerable. Andrew left early for work and came home late. They'd exchanged brief pleasantries, gnawed at each other in passing. exist in the same space without truly connecting. Hal tried to make himself useful. He cleaned the kitchen, did yard work, cooked dinners that Andrew barely touched before retreating to his home office for more work. "You don't have to do all that, Dad," Andrew said one evening, his tone carrying an edge that I couldn't quite identify. Irritation? Guilt? Resentment? "I want to pull my weight," Hal replied, trying to keep his voice light. "I'm not a freeloader." Andrew's jaw tightened. "I didn't say you were." But the implication hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. As the weeks passed, Hal began to notice the subtle ways Andrew's attitude shifted. The brief pleasantries became even briefer. The eye contact disappeared entirely. Andrew started eating dinner in his office, claiming work deadlines. He began making comments, small, cutting remarks that felt like paper cuts, individually insignificant but cumulatively devastating. "Must be nice to sleep in every day," Andrew said one morning, his voice dripping with something that might have been envy or might have been contempt. Hal, who had been awake since 5 a.m. sending out job applications, felt the words like a punch to the gut. "I'm looking for work. Son, it's not like I'm on vacation." "Sure, Dad. Whatever you say." The dismissiveness, the casual cruelty. It reminded Hal of arguments from years ago, of a teenage Andrew slamming doors and shouting accusations, of wounds that had never properly healed, just scabbed over and festered beneath the surface. Hal started spending more time in his room, feeling like a prisoner in a space that was supposed to be a refuge. He'd lie on the bed and let his mind wander through the wreckage of his past, picking through the debris of his life like a survivor, searching for something salvageable. The divorce. Margaret had left him when Andrew was 12, citing his emotional unavailability, his obsession with work, his inability to be present even when he was physically there. She'd been right, of course. Hal could see that now, with the brutal clarity that comes with hindsight. He'd thought providing for his family meant working himself to the bone, but he'd missed the point entirely. His son hadn't needed a paycheck. He'd needed a father. And now here they were, two grown men, strangers sharing a roof, connected by blood but separated by years of unspoken resentment and unresolved pain. The financial stress that had driven Hal to this point was just the surface wound. Beneath it lay decades of poor choices, of prioritizing the wrong things, of believing that success at work could compensate for failure at home. He'd missed Andrew's high school graduation because of a business trip. He'd forgotten birthdays. He'd been a ghost in his own son's life, present in theory but absent in practice. And Andrew remembered. Oh, how he remembered. "You know what's funny, Dad?" Andrew said one evening, his voice thick with alcohol and anger. They'd been watching TV in silence when Andrew suddenly spoke, breaking the fragile peace. "I used to make excuses for you. When Mom would cry because you missed another dinner, another event, another moment that mattered, I'd defend you. He's working hard for us. I'd say, he's doing his best. But you weren't, were you? You were just hiding." Hal felt his throat constrict. "Andrew, I'm not finished." Andrew's eyes were hard, glittering with years of suppressed fury. "I'm 38 years old, and I still catch myself looking for your approval. Still hoping that maybe, just maybe, you'll notice me, see me, care enough to actually be present. But you never did. And now you're here in my house, and I'm supposed to what? Pretend that everything's fine? Play happy family." The words cut deeper than any knife could. Hal wanted to defend himself, to explain, to make Andrew understand that he'd been doing what he thought was right, that he'd loved his son even if he'd been terrible at showing it. But the words died in his throat because underneath Andrew's anger was a truth Hal couldn't deny. He had failed as a father. He had prioritized his ego and his career over the one person who should have mattered most. "I'm sorry," Hal whispered, and even his own ears. It sounded pathetic, inadequate, too little, too late. Andrew laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Yeah, you're sorry. Great. That fixes everything." The tension in the house became unbearable. Hal could feel it pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe, turning every moment into a minefield. He tried to give Andrew space, tried to stay out of his way, but the house wasn't big enough for both their pain. As Christmas approached, Hal felt a desperate need to do something, anything, to bridge the chasm between them. Maybe if he could show Andrew that he was trying, that he cared, that he wanted to be better, maybe then things could start to heal. It was naive. He knew that even as the plan formed in his mind, but desperation makes fools of us all. He spent what little money he had left on ingredients for Andrew's favorite meal, the pot roast and mashed potatoes that Margaret used to make, that Hal had learned the recipe for, but never had time to cook. He bought a gift, something thoughtful and personal, a first edition of Andrew's favorite childhood book that he'd tracked down through online sellers. He decorated the dining room with simple, tasteful Christmas decorations. He wanted to create something warm, something that felt like family, even if it was just an illusion. Christmas Eve arrived with a cold snap that made the air feel brittle and sharp. Hal had been cooking since morning, determined to get everything perfect. When Andrew came home from work, Hal heard the door open and felt his heart rate spike with nervous anticipation. "Andrew, I made dinner. Your favorite, pot roast, and I can smell it, Dad." Andrew's voice was flat as he walked past the dining room, barely glancing at the decorated table. "I'm not really hungry, but it's Christmas Eve. I thought we could." "You thought wrong." Andrew headed toward the stairs, his shoulders tense, his movements sharp with irritation. "I've got work to finish." Something inside Hal snapped. Maybe it was the weeks of walking on eggshells. Maybe it was a crushing weight of rejection. Maybe it was just the final straw after months of indignity and loss. "Andrew, wait. Please. Can we just talk?" Andrew stopped on the stairs, his back to Hal, the silence stretched out, taut and trembling. When he finally turned around, his face was a mask of cold fury. "Talk? You want to talk? Now, after 30 years of silence, you want to have a conversation? I know I haven't been the father you deserved. You don't know anything." Andrew's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "You don't know what it was like being the kid whose dad never showed up. You don't know what it felt like to graduate high school and scan the audience for your face, knowing you wouldn't be there, but hoping anyway. You don't know what it's like to build a successful life and still feel like a failure because the one person whose approval you wanted never gave a damn." "I gave a damn. Everything I did for yourself." Andrew was shouting now, his composure completely shattered. "You worked those long hours for yourself, to feel important, to avoid dealing with your own emotional inadequacies. Don't you dare pretend it was for us. Mom saw through it. I saw through it. You were a coward, Dad. You hid behind your work because being a real father, being present and vulnerable and actually caring, that was too hard for you." The words landed like physical blows. Hal felt his legs weaken, felt the room tilt and spin around him. Because Andrew was right. God help him. His son was absolutely right. "I'm trying now," Hal said, hating how his voice cracked, how pathetic he sounded. "I know I can't undo the past, but I'm here. I'm trying." "You're here because you have nowhere else to go." Andrew descended the stairs, his face flushed with rage and pain. "You're not here because you want to be my father. You're here because I'm your last option, your safety net, the son you ignored for decades who's now supposed to take care of you in your old age. Well, I'm done, Dad. I'm done pretending this is going to work." "Andrew, please. You know what the worst part is?" Andrew's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "I look at you and I see my future. I see a man who prioritized all the wrong things, who woke up one day and realized he was alone, that he'd built a life on sand, and I'm terrified that I'm becoming you. I work too much. I avoid real connections. And having you here, watching you shuffle around my house like a ghost, it's like looking into a mirror I can't stand to face." Hal felt tears burning behind his eyes, felt his chest constricting with a pain so profound it felt like dying. "What do you want me to do?" Andrew ran his hands through his hair, his whole body trembling. "I want you to leave. I thought I could do this, thought I could be the bigger person, but I can't. Every time I see you, I feel like that 12-year-old kid again, wondering why his dad doesn't love him enough to stick around. And I hate it. I hate feeling this way. I hate you for making me feel this way. I never meant. I don't care what you meant. Andrew stormed the closet, pulled out a suitcase, and threw it at Hal's feet. "Pack your things. You need to go. It's Christmas Eve. Where am I supposed to?" "I don't know, Dad. I don't know, and honestly, right now I don't care. Figure it out the way you figured out how to avoid being a father for 30 years. You're good at taking care of yourself. You'll manage." The cruelty in Andrew's voice, the cold dismissal, shattered something fundamental in Hal's core. This was his son, his boy, the child he'd held as an infant, the toddler he'd taught to ride a bike, one of the few memories Hal could actually claim. And now that boy was a man who looked at him with such contempt, such raw hatred, that it felt like being erased. "Andrew, I'm begging you." "Stop." Andrew held up his hand, his eyes wet but his jaw set. "Just stop. Go pack. I want you gone within the hour." Hal stood there, frozen, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be how his story ended. Kicked out by his own son on Christmas Eve, cast into the cold, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. But Andrew had already turned away, had already walked his office and shut the door with finality that echoed to the house like a death knell. Hal climbed the stairs to the guest room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. His hands shook as he pulled clothes from drawers, as he shoved belongings into the suitcase without any sense of organization or care. His mind was a whirlwind of pain and disbelief, replaying Andrew's words over and over, each repetition driving the knife deeper. "I hate you for making me feel this way." That's what his son had said. His son hated him. The relationship Hal had hoped to repair was beyond saving. The damage he'd done was irreversible. He'd failed at his marriage, failed at his career, and now, in the ultimate demonstration of his inadequacy, he'd failed at being a father so completely that his own child couldn't bear be in the same house with him. When Hal emerged from the guest room 45 minutes later, suitcase in hand, Andrew was waiting by the front door. His face was composed now, eerily calm, but his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "There's a motel about 3 miles down Route 9, Andrew said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You should be able to get a room there." "Andrew, please. Can we just—" "Goodbye, Dad." The door opened, letting in a blast of frigid air. Hal felt it cut through his coat, felt it settle into his bones. He looked at his son one last time, searching for any sign of softness, any crack in the armor. But Andrew's face remained impassive, a stranger's face, the face of someone who had made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. Hal stepped out into the night. Behind him, the door closed with a quiet click that sounded like the end of everything. The cold was brutal. Hal's breath came out in white clouds as he stood on the sidewalk, suitcase in hand, staring at the house that had briefly been his home. Through the window, he could see the Christmas tree he'd helped decorate, the lights twinkling merrily, mocking him with their false cheer. Inside that warm house, his son was probably already back at his computer, already pushing down the emotions of what had just happened, already building walls the way Hal had taught him through example. The sins of the father visited upon the son. Hal started walking. He didn't have a car, had sold it months ago when he couldn't afford the insurance. The motel Andrew had mentioned was 3 miles away. In this cold, it might as well have been 30, but what choice did he have? He was a man without options, without resources, without dignity. The streets were empty, everyone inside with their families, celebrating the holiday. Hal passed house after house decorated with lights, heard laughter and music filtering through windows, saw glimpses of the life he'd never managed to build. Each step felt like walking through concrete, his legs heavy with exhaustion and despair. How had it come to this? He'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much, followed all the rules they'd told him mattered. Get a good job, work your way up, provide for your family. But somewhere along the way, the rules had changed, and no one had bothered to tell him. Or maybe the rules had always been a lie, and he'd been too blind or too stubborn to see it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. For a moment, his heart leaped. Maybe Andrew had changed his mind. Maybe his son had realized how cruel he'd been. Maybe there was still hope for redemption. But when Hal pulled out the phone, it was just an automated message from his bank, reminding him that his account was overdrawn. Of course it was. Hal laughed, a sound that came out more like a sob. Even the universe was piling on now, kicking him when he was already down. He stood there on the empty street, Christmas lights blurring through tears. He couldn't hold back anymore and let himself break. Great, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in his chest, purging years of suppressed emotion and accumulated pain. He'd lost everything. His job, his home, his dignity, his son. What was left? What reason did he have to keep going? He was 67 years old, broke, homeless on Christmas Eve, rejected by the only family he had left. Maybe it would be easier to just give up, to lie down in the snow and let the cold take him, to stop fighting a battle he'd already lost. The thought was seductive in its simplicity. Just stop. Just let go. Just end this nightmare of a life that had brought him nothing but disappointment and regret. But even as the thought formed, something in Hal resisted. Some stubborn core of himself that had survived the divorce, the job loss, the indignity of begging his son for help. That part of him wasn't ready to quit. Not yet. Not like this. He started walking again, one foot in front of the other, because that's all he knew how to do. Keep moving. Keep trying. Keep pretending that effort mattered, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. The motel appeared in the distance like a mirage, a run-down, single-story building with flickering neon sign that read "Very antsy," the sea had burned out long ago. It was the kind of place where people went when they'd run out of better options, where dreams came to die quietly and without fanfare. It was perfect for Hal in his current state. The office was manned by a tired-looking clerk who barely glanced at Hal as he counted out cash for a single night's stay. $80 for a room that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke, with a sagging bed and a bathroom that made Hal's skin crawl. But it was shelter. It was warm. It was all he could afford. Hal sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his reflection in the grimy mirror across the room. The man looking back at him was a stranger, hollow-eyed, broken, old in a way that had nothing to do with the number of years he'd been alive. When had he become this person? When had he stopped fighting? His mind drifted back through the years, trying to pinpoint the exact moment where everything went wrong. Was it the divorce? Earlier? Was it the first time he chose to work late instead of going to one of Andrew's Little League games? Was it when he stopped asking Margaret how her day was because he was too exhausted to care? Was it some fundamental flaw in his character, some inability to connect with people on a meaningful level that had doomed him from the start? Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he'd just been selfish. Maybe beneath all the rationalizations and excuses, he'd simply chosen himself over the people who needed him, over and over again, until there was no one left. The guilt was crushing. It sat on his chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. Every mistake played on an endless loop, the missed birthdays, the broken promises, the times he'd been physically present but emotionally absent, his mind always somewhere else, always focused on work or worries or anything except the moment he was actually living in. Andrew had been right about everything. Hal had been a coward. He'd hidden behind his work because it was easier than being vulnerable, easier than risking real emotional connection. Because if you never really try, you never really fail, right? Except that logic was backwards. By not trying, he'd failed in the most complete and devastating way possible. The night stretched on, endless and dark. Hal didn't sleep. How could he? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Andrew's face, heard his son's voice cracking with decades of suppressed pain. "I hate you for making me feel this way." Those words would haunt him for the rest of his life. However many days or weeks or years he had left, that moment would be seared into his memory, a permanent scar on his soul. Christmas morning arrived without fanfare. No presents, no family gathering, no warmth or joy or any of the things the day was supposed to represent. Just Hal, alone in a motel room, watching dust motes float through the thin light filtering between the curtains. He should get up, should figure out his next move, should start making calls, finding resources, plotting his survival. But the exhaustion was too profound, the despair too complete. He lay there, paralyzed by the weight of his own failure, unable to see any path forward that didn't lead to more pain and humiliation. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. Hal's heart jumped, irrational hope flooding through him, that maybe Andrew had tracked him down, that maybe his son had come to apologize, to take back the harsh words, to offer forgiveness. He scrambled to the door, yanked it open, and found himself facing a man he barely recognized. Tom Hendricks. Jesus. Tom Hendricks, who had worked in accounting at Hal's old company, who Hal had shared countless coffee breaks with over the years. They'd been friendly but not friends. The kind of workplace relationship that exists within office walls, but rarely extends beyond them. Hal. Tom's eyes widened in surprise and concern. I thought that was you I saw walking last night. I was driving by and... What the hell are you doing at the Starlight Motel on Christmas? The concern in Tom's voice, the genuine human warmth, nearly broke Hal all over again. It's a long story. I've got time. Tom glanced over his shoulder at his car, then back at Hal. Look, I know we weren't close at work, but nobody should be alone in a place like this on Christmas. My wife and I are having a quiet day at home. The kids are with their mom this year, and we've got more food than we know what to do with. Why didn't you come over? Have a meal at least. Hal wanted to refuse, wanted to preserve what little dignity he had left, to not impose on someone who barely knew him, to not be one more burden on one more person. But the loneliness, the crushing isolation of the past 12 hours, made the offer sound like salvation. I don't want to intrude, Hal said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're not intruding. I'm inviting. Come on, grab your coat. Tom's house was modest but warm, a small ranch-style home filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that comes from actually living in a space, not just existing in it. Tom's wife, Linda, greeted Hal with a hug that caught him off guard, the kind of unself-conscious affection that comes from genuinely good people who haven't had their capacity for compassion beaten out of them yet. Over dinner, a simple but delicious meal of ham and vegetables, the conversation flowed naturally. Tom and Linda didn't pry into Hal's situation, didn't ask uncomfortable questions about why he was alone at a roadside motel on Christmas. They just talked about movies they'd seen, books they'd read, the absurdity of their shared workplace before the layoffs. Normal, human conversation that felt like oxygen to someone who'd been suffocating. I heard about your layoff, Tom said eventually, his tone careful. That was brutal. They axed half the department with no warning. Yeah. Hal found it easier to talk about this than to mess with Andrew. 32 years, and they showed me the door in 20 minutes. It's criminal what they're doing to experienced workers, Linda said, her voice sharp with indignation. My brother went through the same thing at his company. Worked there for 25 years, and they replaced it with someone fresh out of college who they could pay half as much. The ageism in this country is disgusting. The validation felt strange. How it spent so many months internalizing rejection, believing on some level that maybe he deserved it, that maybe he really was obsolete and useless. Hearing someone else name the injustice, acknowledge the systemic cruelty of it, created a tiny crack in the wall of self-loathing he'd built around himself. They talked for hours about the economy, about the way corporations treat employees as disposable, about the challenge of rebuilding at their age, about the fear and uncertainty that comes with starting over when you're supposed to be thinking about retirement. It's not just about the money, Hal found himself saying, surprised by his own candor. It's about who you are, you know? I was Hal Mitchell, senior analyst. I had a title. I had respect. People came to me for answers. And then suddenly I'm just nobody. Just an old guy taking up space. You're not nobody, Tom said firmly. You're a person who got screwed over by a system that values profit over people. That doesn't define your worth. The words were kind, but Hal couldn't quite accept them, because his worth or lack thereof had been confirmed not just by his employer, but by his own son. Andrew's rejection had validated every fear Hal had about himself. He was a failure. He was unwanted. He was a burden that people were better off without. But he didn't say any of this. He just nodded and changed the subject, deflecting away from the deeper pain he wasn't ready to confront. As evening approached and Hal prepared to leave, Tom stopped him at the door. Look, I know we're not close, but if you need anything, a reference for job applications, someone to talk to, whatever, you've got my number. Don't be a stranger, okay? The kindness, offered without expectation or judgment, created a lump in Hal's throat. Thank you, He managed, for today, for everything. Linda hugged him again. Merry Christmas, Hal. Things will get better. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but they will. Hal wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But as he walked back to the motel in the gathering darkness, the weight of his reality settled over him again. One kind gesture didn't erase the fundamental truth of his situation. He was alone, broke, and rejected by the person who should have loved him most. The days after Christmas blurred together. Hal stayed at the motel for a week, burning through what little money he had left while sending out job applications that went unanswered and calling shelters that were full. The desperation sharpened with each passing day, the fear of homelessness becoming less abstract and more immediately threatening. He considered calling Andrew, picked up his phone a dozen times, stared at his son's number, tried to compose messages that would somehow bridge the chasm between them. But every time, he put the phone down without sending anything. What could he possibly say? I'm sorry felt pathetically inadequate. Please take me back felt like begging. You were right about everything felt like surrender. So he said nothing. And Andrew said nothing. And the silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. Eventually, Tom helped Hal find a room in a boarding house. A grim place with shared bathrooms and thin walls. But it was affordable and it was shelter. Hal got a part-time job stocking shelves at a grocery store. Overnight shift, minimum wage. It was humiliating work for a man with his experience and education. But humiliation had become his new normal. He worked. He slept. He existed. The anger that had fueled him initially had burned out, replaced by a kind of numb acceptance. This was his life now. This was what he deserved. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It started small. A co-worker at a grocery store, a woman named Rita, who was in her 50s and had her own story of corporate betrayal and starting over, struck up a conversation with Hal during a break. They started having coffee together before shifts, sharing their stories, commiserating about the absurdity of their situations while also finding dark humor in it. You know what I realized? Rita said one morning, stirring sugar into her terrible break room coffee. They can take our jobs. They can take our homes. They can take our pride. But they can't take who we are. Not unless we let them. The word seemed simplistic at first, the kind of inspirational poster nonsense that usually made Hal cringe, but they stuck with him because he had been letting them. Letting his former employer, letting Andrew, letting everyone define his worth. He'd internalized every rejection, every criticism, every harsh word, and built an identity around being unwanted and inadequate. But was that true? Was that who he really was? Or was it just a story he'd been telling himself, a narrative of failure that was easier to accept than the harder truth? That he'd made mistakes, yes, but he was still a person of value, still someone with skills and experience and knowledge, still someone capable of growth and change. The shift in perspective didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, hard-fought, earned through hours of painful self-reflection. Hal started seeing a therapist, a free clinic that offered services to low-income patients, and began the difficult work of untangling his self-worth from external validation, of understanding that his identity wasn't defined by his job title or his bank account, or even his relationship with his son. He was Harold Mitchell. He'd made terrible mistakes. He'd failed in profound ways, but he was also resilient. He'd survived a divorce, a job loss, homelessness, rejection by his only child. He was still here, still breathing, still trying. That had to count for something. He started reconnecting with old hobbies he'd abandoned decades ago. Woodworking, something he loved as a young man, but given up when work consumed his life. He bought cheap tools at a pawn shop and started making simple things in a corner of the boarding house basement. The work was meditative, requiring focus and care, creating something tangible and real from raw materials. Each piece he completed felt like a small victory, a bookshelf, a picture frame, a simple wooden box with dovetail joints. They weren't masterpieces, but they were his, evidence that he could still create, still contribute, still make something of value. He joined a support group for older workers who'd been laid off, found community with people who understood the unique pain of age discrimination, the fear of starting over late in life, the challenge of maintaining dignity when society has decided you're disposable. They shared job leads, offered encouragement, reminded each other that their worth wasn't determined by employment status. Slowly, painfully, Hal began to rebuild. Not his old life, that was gone irretrievable, but something new, something smaller and humbler, but also, in some ways, more authentic. He wasn't pretending anymore, wasn't hiding behind a job title or a facade of success. He was just Hal, a flawed human being trying his best with what he had. The pain of Andrew's rejection never fully went away. It sat in his chest like a stone, a constant ache that flared up at unexpected moments. When he saw fathers with their adult children when holidays approached, when he caught himself thinking about reaching out and then remembering the look of contempt on his son's face. But he learned to carry it, learned that you can hold pain and hope simultaneously, that grief and healing aren't mutually exclusive. He wrote letters to Andrew that he never sent, pouring out apologies and explanations and love that had no outlet. The writing itself became therapeutic, a way to process emotions he'd suppressed for decades. 6 months after that terrible Christmas Eve, Hal's phone rang with an unknown number. His heart raced as he answered, some irrational part of him still hoping, still waiting. Hello, is this Harold Mitchell? An unfamiliar voice. Professional. Formal. Yes, this is Hal. My name is Jennifer Reeves. I'm calling from Cornerstone Consulting. We received your application for the senior analyst position and would like to schedule an interview. The world tilted. Hal had sent out hundreds of applications by that point, had received countless rejections or, more commonly, no response at all. An actual interview felt like winning the lottery. Yes. Yes, absolutely. When will be convenient? The interview went well. Hal was rusty, nervous, painfully aware of the 6-month gap in his employment and the shabby clothes he wore because he couldn't afford better. But something must have clicked because 2 weeks later, they offered him the position. The salary was less than what he'd made before, the title less prestigious, but it was legitimate work in his field. It was a second chance. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by a strange melancholy. Because the person Hal wanted to share this news with, the person he wanted to call and say, I did it, I'm back on my feet, that person wouldn't take his call. Andrew's number sat at his phone like a grenade, dangerous and tempting. 100 times Hal started to dial it. 100 times he stopped himself. What would he even say? I got a job, so you can stop being ashamed of me now? The thought made him sick. His relationship with his son shouldn't be conditional on employment status. It should be rooted in love, in family, in something deeper than economic utility. But Hal had no idea how to bridge that gap. The wounds were too deep, the history too complicated. He destroyed Andrew's ability to trust him through years of absence and neglect. How could one phone call, one apology, possibly repair that kind of damage? So he focused on what he could control, his own healing, his own growth. He moved out of the boarding house into a small studio apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was clean and safe and his. He furnished it with pieces he'd made himself. That gave him more pride than any expensive furniture could have. He was building a life on his own terms, without relying on anyone else's approval or support. The anger that had consumed him initially, at his former employer, at the unfairness of age discrimination, at a society that discards people the moment they stop being economically useful, transformed into something more productive. He started volunteering with organizations that help older workers navigate job loss, offering the kind of support and resources he desperately needed during his darkest days. He testified at city council meetings about age discrimination, wrote letters to newspapers, became an advocate for workers' rights. The pain of his experience became fuel for purpose. He couldn't change what had happened to him, but he could maybe prevent it from happening to others, or at least make it a little less devastating when it inevitably did. Rita, his friend from the grocery store, noticed a change in him. You seem different, she said one day over coffee. They still met regularly, even though Hal no longer worked there. Lighter, somehow. I don't know about lighter, Hal replied. I still carry a lot of regret, a lot of guilt about my son. But you're carrying it differently. You're not letting it crush you anymore. She was right. The guilt was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer defined him. He'd done terrible things as a father, made choices that hurt the person who should have been his priority. But he was trying to be better now, not for Andrew's approval or forgiveness. He'd long since accepted that he might never get either, but because it was the right thing to do. Because personal growth isn't about redemption. It's about becoming someone you can live with. 8 months after being kicked out, Hal received a text message, unknown number, but the words made his heart stop. "Dad, it's Andrew. Can we talk?" The phone nearly slipped from Hal's shaking hands. He read the message 3 times, searching for hidden meanings, trying to interpret tone from 17 characters. Was this an olive branch? An angry confrontation? A final goodbye? He stared at the screen for 10 minutes before responding, typing and deleting half a dozen different replies before settling on, "Yes, anytime you want." 3 dots appeared, indicating Andrew was typing. Disappeared. Appeared again. Hal held his breath. "Can you come to the house tomorrow? Around 2 p.m. I'll be there." Hal didn't sleep that night. His mind raced through every possible scenario, from reconciliation to further rejection. He practiced what he'd say, rehearse apologies, try to prepare himself for whatever was coming. But nothing could truly prepare him for facing his son again, for seeing the person he'd hurt most deeply and trying to find words adequate to express his remorse. The next day, Hal stood on Andrew's doorstep at exactly 2 p.m., his hand trembling as he rang the doorbell. When the door opened, Hal was struck by how tired Andrew looked, dark circles under his eyes, his face drawn and pale. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, years of pain and anger and love swirling in the space between them. "Come in," Andrew said finally, his voice neutral. Hal followed his son into the living room, that same room where their relationship had exploded 8 months ago. The Christmas decorations were long gone, but the memory of that night hung heavy in the air. They sat across from each other, the coffee table between them feeling like an insurmountable distance. Andrew spoke first. "I've been seeing a therapist." That's good." Hal didn't know what else to say. "She's been helping me work through a lot of stuff. About Mom, about you, about the way I've been living my life." Andrew's hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. "And she made me realize something I didn't want to face. I was becoming you." The words hit Hal like a punch, but he stayed quiet, letting Andrew continue. "The way I work obsessively, the way I avoid real emotional connection, the way I use anger to push people away when they get too close. I saw those patterns in my whole life, and I hated them, and somehow I absorbed them anyway." Andrew's voice cracked. "And having you here, seeing those patterns reflected back at me every day, it terrified me. So I lashed out. I said horrible things. I kicked you out because I couldn't stand looking at my own future." "You weren't wrong about what you said," Hal interjected, his voice rough with emotion. "About me being a coward, about hiding behind work, about failing you as a father. You were absolutely right. Being right doesn't make it okay," Andrew said. "The way I treated you, especially on Christmas Eve, that was cruel. You're my father, and you were in crisis, and instead of helping you, I made everything worse because I was too wrapped up in my own pain to see yours." Tears were streaming down both their faces now, years of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. "I'm sorry," Hal said, and this time the words didn't feel inadequate. "I'm so sorry for all of it. For not being there when you needed me. For prioritizing work over you. For making you feel like you didn't matter. You mattered. You always mattered. I was just too broken to show it properly." "I know you love me," Andrew said quietly. "Even when you weren't there, even when you were absent, I knew, on some level, that you loved me. You just didn't know how to show it in a way I could feel." "I'm learning," Hal said. "I know it's late. I know I can't undo the past. But I'm trying to be better. Not just for you, but for myself. Because you were right about something else, too. I've been running from my own inadequacies my whole life. And I'm tired of running." They talked for hours. Really talked, in a way they never had before. Andrew shared his own struggles. His failing marriage, his workaholic tendencies, his fear of ending up alone and bitter. Hal shared his journey over the past months, the pain and growth, the slow realization that self-worth comes from within, not from external validation. It wasn't a magical reconciliation. The wounds were too deep for that, the history too complicated. But it was a beginning, a tentative first step toward something healthier, something real. I don't know if we can have the kind of relationship I wanted as a kid, Andrew said as the conversation wound down. Too much has happened. Too much damage has been done. I know, Hal replied, but maybe we can build something new. Not what should have been, but what can be, if you're willing to try. I'm willing, Andrew said, but it's going to take time, and work, and probably more therapy. I'm in therapy, too, Hal admitted, through the community health center. It helps. Andrew smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Hal had seen on his face in as long as he could remember. Look at us, two broken men trying to fix ourselves. Better late than never, Hal said. As Hal left Andrew's house that day, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the naive hope of complete healing or perfect reconciliation, but the cautious hope that comes from seeing a path forward, however difficult and uncertain. The relationship with Andrew didn't magically repair itself after that conversation. They met for coffee once a week, brief, sometimes awkward meetings where they learned how to talk to each other honestly. There were setbacks, old patterns resurfacing, arguments that echoed past pain. But there was also progress. Slow, incremental movement toward understanding and, maybe eventually, forgiveness. Hal continued his own journey of healing. He threw himself into his new job, not with the obsessive workaholism of his past, but with balanced engagement. He made friends at work. He continued his woodworking. He dated a woman named Susan who'd also experienced loss and starting over, who understood that healing isn't linear and some scars never fully fade. He learned to set boundaries, with himself, with others, to recognize when he was falling into old patterns of using work to avoid emotions, to sit with discomfort instead of running from it, to accept that being vulnerable wasn't weakness, but courage. A year after that terrible Christmas Eve, Hal and Andrew had dinner together. Just a simple meal at a local restaurant, nothing fancy or forced. They talked about work, about Andrew's progress in therapy, about Hal's latest woodworking project. It was normal, comfortable in a way their relationship had never been. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Andrew said as they were leaving, "for doing the work, for not giving up, even when everything fell apart." The words created a lump in Hal's throat. "I'm proud of you too, son, for being strong enough to confront your pain, for being brave enough to try again with me when you had every reason not to." They hugged, briefly, still a little awkwardly, but genuine. It was enough. As Hal drove home that night, he thought about the journey he'd been on, from the devastation of job loss to the humiliation of begging his son for help, from the crushing rejection of being kicked out on Christmas Eve to the slow, painful process of rebuilding himself from the ground up. It had been the worst year of his life and, paradoxically, the most transformative. He'd lost everything and, in losing everything, had found something he'd never had before: himself. Not the man he thought he should be, not the father he wished he'd been, but the flawed, broken, resilient human being he actually was. The anger was mostly gone now, replaced by acceptance. Yes, he'd been treated unfairly by his employer. Yes, age discrimination was real and systemic and wrong. But staying angry about it only gave those corporations more power over his life. He couldn't change what they'd done to him, but he could change how he responded to it. The pain of Andrew's rejection had transformed too. It would always hurt. Some wounds don't fully heal, but it no longer defined him. He'd failed as a father, yes, but he was trying to do better now. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but whether they take responsibility for those mistakes and work to change. Hal thought about all the people who'd helped him along the way. Tom and Linda, who'd offered kindness when he desperately needed it. Rita, who'd reminded him that his worth wasn't determined by employment status. His therapist, who'd guided him through the darkest valleys of self-recrimination. Susan, who'd shown him that it was possible to love again, to trust again, even after betrayal and loss. He thought about the other older workers he'd met through his advocacy work, people who'd experienced similar devastation and were fighting their own battles to rebuild. They created a community of survivors, supporting each other through the indignity and fear, reminding each other their value when the world tried to convince them otherwise. And he thought about Andrew, his son, the person who caused him the deepest pain and who was now teaching him what real courage looked like. The courage to face your own brokenness, to acknowledge your mistakes, to try again even when you're terrified of being hurt. The journey wasn't over. Hal knew that. He was still working a job that paid less than he deserved. He was still living in a small apartment, still rebuilding his savings slowly. His relationship with Andrew was still fragile, still a work in progress. There were no guarantees, no promises of happy endings. But he was alive. He was trying. He was growing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Hal pulled into his apartment complex, he thought about a question his therapist had asked him recently. If you could go back and change things, would you? His first instinct had been to say yes. Absolutely. He'd change everything. He'd be a better father, a more present husband, a more balanced person who didn't sacrifice family for career. He'd avoid the mistakes that had led to his current situation. But as he sat with the question, he realized something surprising. He wasn't sure he would change things, because those mistakes, as painful as they were, had led him here, to this moment of growth and self-awareness, to a relationship with his son that, while still healing, was more honest than it had ever been before, to an understanding of himself that he'd never had when life was comfortable and unchallenged. The pain had been necessary. The loss had been necessary, not because he deserved it. No one deserved that kind of suffering, but because it had broken him open in ways that allowed real transformation. Sometimes, Hal had learned, the hardest moments in life lead to the greatest transformations, not because pain is noble or suffering builds character. That's just the kind of platitude people use to make tragedy palatable. But because crisis forces us to confront truths we'd rather avoid, to examine lives we'd rather leave unexamined, to choose whether we'll let our failures define us or refine us. Hal had chosen refinement. It had been the harder choice, the more painful path, but it was also the more authentic one. As he walked into his apartment, he looked around at the life he'd built, small, humble, but his, the furniture he'd made with his own hands, the books he was finally reading, the photographs of Andrew from childhood that he'd unpacked and displayed, no longer running from the pain of what he'd lost, but honoring the love that had always been there, however imperfectly expressed. This was his life now, not the life he'd planned, not the life he'd wanted, but a life that was real and hard-earned and, in its own way, beautiful. Hal sat down at a small kitchen table and pulled out his journal, another tool his therapist had recommended. He wrote about the dinner with Andrew, about the progress they'd made, about the hope he felt tempered by the realistic understanding that healing takes time. And then he wrote something else, something he'd been thinking about for months. To anyone who's reading this, whoever you are, wherever you're at in your own journey, I want you to know that it's possible to survive the unsurvivable. It's possible to lose everything and still find reasons to keep going. It's possible to fail at the things that matter most and still become someone worth being. The journey won't look like you expect. It won't be neat or linear or fair. There will be setbacks and relapses and moments where you're convinced you can't take another step. But you can. You will. Because the alternative, giving up, staying broken, letting your failures define you forever, that's not really an alternative at all. So if you're in that dark place right now, if you've lost your job or your home or your relationship with the people you love most, if you feel like you've failed at life in ways that can't be fixed, I see you. I've been you. I am you in many ways, still working through the wreckage of my own poor choices. But I'm also here, still standing, still trying, still believing, against all rational evidence, that tomorrow might be better than today. And if I can do it, a 67-year-old man who lost everything and had to rebuild from nothing, then so can you. The question isn't whether you'll face hardship. You will. Life guarantees that. The question is what you'll do with it. Will you let it crush you, Or will you let it crack you open in ways that allow light to get in? Will you stay stuck in anger and resentment? Or will you do the hard work of forgiveness? Not for others, but for yourself? Will you define your worth by external measures, job, money, status? Or will you find something deeper, something that can't be taken away by corporate restructuring or economic downturns or the judgment of others? These aren't easy questions. I'm still figuring out the answers myself. But I'm learning that the process of asking them, of wrestling with them honestly, is where the real transformation happens. So here's my final thought, the lesson I've learned through the most painful year of my life. Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the greatest transformations. Not always, not predictably, but sometimes. And sometimes is enough to keep going. Sometimes is enough to try again. Sometimes is enough to believe that even in the midst of loss and pain and failure, there's still the possibility of becoming someone better than you were. Are you ready to change? I don't know, but if you're reading this, if you're still here, still searching, still hoping, then you're already taking the first step. And that, my friend, is more than enough. Hal closed a journal and sat in the quiet of his apartment, feeling the weight of everything he'd been through and everything he'd learned. The journey wasn't over. It might never be over. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, he was okay with that. He was Harold Mitchell. He'd failed and fallen and lost everything that once defined him. And he'd survived. And somehow, impossibly, that was turning out to be enough. Hal's journey isn't just a story about loss. It's a story about resilience, growth, and reclaiming your life no matter where you are or how much you've been through. Whether you're facing the weight of rejection, the sting of betrayal, or the silence of a relationship that once meant everything, it's never too late to start over. If Hal's story touched your heart, share your thoughts with us in the comments below. What have you learned about family, forgiveness, and self-worth from his journey? How do you find strength when everything feels like it's falling apart? Don't forget to like this video if you believe that change and growth are always possible, even in the darkest times. Subscribe for more stories of hope, healing, and the powerful human spirit. Remember, sometimes the hardest chapters in life lead to the greatest transformations. Are you ready for your own change?